my defense, New York rain is a miserable thing. It doesn't wash the city clean, it just makes the grime slick and the smell of blood linger longer on the asphalt. I stood under the flickering amber light of an abandoned Brooklyn shipyard, the heavy downpour drumming against my yellow raincoat. At my feet lay 5 bodies. 4 of them were ordinary street trash, already bagged and tagged. The 5th, however, was a masterpiece of bespoke tailoring and catastrophic blunt force trauma. Vincent Thorne. Even an underground cleaner like me, someone who spent the last 15 years hiding in the city's blind spots, knew that name. He was the apex predator of Manhattan the Alpha who ruled the Thorne Corporation with an iron fist and a notoriously low tolerance for incompetence. Or rather, he was. Right now, he was just my Tuesday night VIP ticket to paying off my adopted son's kindergarten tuition. I crouched beside him, unscrewing the cap of a heavy-duty chemical solvent. "Sorry, Your Majesty," I muttered, the acrid smell of industrial lye cutting through the ozone. But a job is a job. Nothing personal. I tilted the heavy plastic jug. The thick, corrosive liquid was inches away from melting a $10,000 suit into a toxic puddle when a sudden violent sound shattered the quiet of the night. A loud cough erupted from the man. I froze. My hand instinctively dropped the jug and flew to the combat knife strapped to my thigh in less than a second. The corpse hacked violently, rolling onto his side. He spat out a mouthful of dark blood and rainwater, his broad shoulders heaving as he gasped for air. Then the pheromones hit me. It was like a physical wall of heat slamming into my chest. The scent of dark roast coffee gunpowder and raw, unfiltered dominance exploded into the cold air. It was a suffocating alpha aura, defensive and terrifyingly aggressive, driven purely by survival instinct. A normal Omega would have hit their knees, instantly paralyzed by the sheer biological pressure. But I wasn't a normal Omega. I was a former assassin whose scent glands were scarred and whose patience was currently hanging by a very thin thread. I drew my suppressed Glock 19 and aimed it dead between his eyes. "Don't move." Vincent Thorne slowly pushed himself up. Blood matted his dark hair and a deep laceration ran down the side of his temple. He looked up at me, blinking through the rain. The terrifying alpha pheromones were still rolling off him in suffocating waves, screaming threat and territory. But his eyes were completely, utterly blank. His voice was a raw, gravelly rasp. He stared at my gun, then at the dead bodies around him, and finally back at me. He tilted his head, looking genuinely perplexed. "Who am I?" I stared at him. The feared tyrant of the New York underworld was sitting in a puddle looking at me like a lost, oversized golden retriever that had just been hit by a taxi. "Rowan," I cursed under my breath. The passenger door of my beat-up Ford pickup parked 20 yards away had creaked open. A tiny figure in a ridiculously oversized yellow raincoat came splashing through the puddles. "Leo, get back in the truck!" I barked, keeping my gun leveled at the amnesiac Mafia boss. Leo, my 5-year-old adopted menace, completely ignored me. He trotted right up to the terrifying Alpha, staring down at him with wide, curious eyes. Vincent, leaking pheromones that could start a gang war, stared back at the kid. "Rowan," Leo gasped, his little hands clutching the hem of his coat. "He's bleeding. Can we keep him? Please." "He's not a stray dog, Leo. He's a highly dangerous target that I was paid to melt into a puddle." "But look at him. He looks sad." Leo pointed a tiny accusatory finger at me. "You said we should be nice to animals." Before I could explain that this particular animal owned half the politicians in the state and routinely threw people off skyscrapers, my burner phone vibrated in my pocket. Keeping one eye on the very confused Alpha, I pulled it out and hit answer. "Is it done?" A voice hissed through the receiver. It was mechanically distorted, but the arrogant cadence was unmistakable. Silas Croft, Thorne's right-hand man. The snake had finally bitten the lion. "I'm in the middle of it," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I don't want a trace left cleaner," Silas ordered. "No bones, no teeth, no DNA. Do this right, and a bonus of $1 million will be wired to your offshore account by dawn. I need absolute confirmation that Vincent Thorne has been eradicated. $1 million. That was Leo's college fund. That was a house in the suburbs. That was a ticket out of this miserable, blood-soaked life. All I had to do was squeeze the trigger and pour the acid. It was clean. It was simple." I looked down. Vincent had somehow managed to sit up straighter. He wasn't looking at my gun. He was looking at Leo, who had taken off his tiny dinosaur-patterned scarf and was clumsily trying to wrap it around the billionaire's bleeding head. Vincent didn't push him away. Instead, his overwhelming alpha pheromones shifted, forming a heavy protective barrier around the kid completely instinctively. I looked at the gun in my hand. I looked at the $1 million bounty on the phone screen. Then I looked at the hopeful, pleading eyes of my son and the bewildered, blood-soaked Mafia boss wearing a toddler's dinosaur scarf. I let out a long, exhausted sigh. "Client," I spoke into the phone, my tone ice cold. "The target has been completely vaporized, nothing left but ash." I hung up, snapped the burner phone in half, and tossed it into the harbor. I holstered my weapon and walked over to the towering alpha, grabbing him by the collar of his ruined designer suit. "All right, get up, big guy," I grumbled, hauling him to his feet. "If you puke in my truck, you're walking to Brooklyn." Getting a 6'3" apex predator into a 4th floor walk-up in Brooklyn without alerting the neighbors was exactly as exhausting as it sounds. By the time I managed to shove Vincent Thorne through my peeling front door, my bruised ribs were screaming. My apartment was a cramped, perpetually cold shoebox that smelled of cheap laundry detergent and old wood. To a billionaire Mafia boss, it was probably the equivalent of a dumpster. But to his amnesiac brain, it seemed to be a fascinating new world. Vincent stood perfectly still in the middle of my tiny living room, his head practically brushing the ceiling fan. He was still wearing his ruined, acid-singed bespoke suit, looking completely out of place next to Leo's plastic dinosaur toy bin. "All right, listen to me very carefully," I said, locking the deadbolt and turning to face him. "This is not a charity. If you are staying here, there are rules. The Brooklyn rules. You don't break things, you don't answer the door, and you earn your keep." Vincent blinked, tilting his head. "Earn my keep." "Yes." I pointed a finger at his broad chest. "You clean. You cook. You do the laundry. You are officially the maid until I figure out what to do with you." Leo, who had been watching this exchange with wide, sparkling eyes, suddenly darted into the kitchen. He scurried back a second later, holding up a ridiculously bright pink apron covered in violently yellow daisies. It was a gag gift from a former associate, but Leo treated it like a holy relic. "Here," Leo chirped, shoving the pink fabric into Vincent's massive, blood-stained hands. "You have to wear the uniform." I fully expected the alpha to snap the kid's neck. Instead, the terrifying tyrant of the New York underworld stared at the daisies, then at Leo, and solemnly nodded. 2 minutes later, Vincent Thorne, the man who had single-handedly orchestrated the collapse of 3 rival syndicates last year, was standing in my cramped kitchen, wearing a tight pink daisy apron. He looked like a very lethal, very confused baker. I rubbed my temples, already feeling a migraine building. Just try not to burn the apartment down. Over the next 3 days, my life devolved into a bizarre domestic fever dream. I quickly realized that whatever chemical cocktail and blunt force trauma had wiped Vincent's memory had also completely scrambled his biology. Specifically, his alpha instincts were glitching in the most spectacularly inconvenient way possible. I discovered this on a Thursday night. I just returned from a brutal cleanup job in Queens. I was exhausted nursing a busted lip and stinking heavily of bleached copper blood and gunpowder. Normally smelling like fresh violence and distress would send any healthy alpha into a territorial frenzy, either driving them to attack the perceived threat or aggressively assert dominance. I unlocked the door, fully prepared to draw my weapon if Vincent's instincts flared. The moment I stepped inside, the air shifted. The heavy, suffocating scent of dark roast coffee and dominant alpha pheromones slammed into me. Vincent was standing by the kitchen counter, his eyes dilated, his chest heaving. His pheromones were screaming, "Danger mine, protect thick enough to make a normal Omega's knees buckle." I braced myself, hand on my knife. "Vincent, back off." He closed the distance between us in a terrifying blur of speed. But instead of attacking me or pinning me to the wall, this 220-pound killing machine dropped to his knees, wrapped his massive arms around my waist, and buried his face directly into my stomach. "You smell like hurt." He rumbled, his voice a pathetic, gravelly whine that completely contradicted the terrifying aura rolling off him. "Don't like it. Hold me." I froze my hand, hovering over my knife. "What? Hold me?" He mumbled into my sweater, tightening his grip like a giant, needy golden retriever. He rubbed his cheek against my scent gland, trying to desperately cover the smell of gunpowder with his own coffee-scented pheromones. "Stay here." "I'm standing right here, you oversized idiot. Let go of my legs." "No." It was utterly humiliating. For 20 minutes, the feared Rowan former top-tier assassin was trapped in his own hallway, desperately trying to pry a clingy Mafia boss off his legs while enduring a barrage of mixed signal pheromones. I was fighting for my life against a cuddle puddle. The next morning wasn't much better. I woke up to the smell of something turning to pure carbon. I sprinted into the kitchen gun, drawn only to find Vincent still in the pink apron, staring intensely at a frying pan that was currently emitting black smoke. "I am making the eggs," Vincent announced, his face completely serious, as if he were strategizing a cartel takeover. "You are summoning a demon, Vincent," I groaned, cracking a window. Leo was sitting at the table, happily eating a bowl of dry cereal. "He burned the toast too," Leo informed me cheerfully. "But he opened the jar of peanut butter that you couldn't open yesterday," before I could point out that Vincent had opened the jar by accidentally crushing the lid with his bare hands. My new burner phone vibrated on the counter. I glanced at the screen. It was an encrypted number, the organization. I held up a finger, signaling Leo and Vincent to be quiet. Vincent immediately stopped scraping the charcoal eggs and stood at attention, watching me with those intense blank eyes. I answered the call, my voice instantly dropping into the flat, deadpan tone of a professional cleaner. "Speak, Rowan." Silas Croft's distorted voice hissed through the speaker. "We have a problem. The cleanup you performed, my men swept the shipyard. The acid puddle was there, but forensics found anomalies. We cannot fully confirm Thorn is dead." I kept my face perfectly still. "I vaporized him, Silas. The acid doesn't leave teeth." "I need to be certain," Silas demanded, his paranoia bleeding through the line. "I am authorizing a new contract, a scouting mission. I want you to tap into your old network. Track down any whisper, any ghost of Vincent Thorn. If he is alive in this city, find him." I looked across the kitchen. The ghost, the terrifying phantom of the underworld currently at the top of Silas's hit list, was holding a pink dish towel. He had managed to get flour on his nose and was currently watching Leo demonstrate how to make a dinosaur roar using a burnt piece of toast. I looked back at the phone, my expression entirely devoid of light. "Understood," I said smoothly. "He won't escape me. I'll keep my eyes open." I hung up the phone. Vincent looked at me, tilting his head like a confused puppy. "Who was that?" he asked in his deep rasp. "Just a client." I sighed, grabbing the frying pan from him before he could set the smoke alarm off. "Now grab a sponge, Your Majesty. You missed a spot on the counter." By week 3 of what I privately called the Brooklyn hostage situation, a terrifying shift had occurred in my apartment. The terrifying tyrant of the New York underworld had seamlessly morphed into a 1950s American housewife. It was deeply, fundamentally unsettling. I was a man used to the scent of ozone bleach and gunpowder. Now my home smelled perpetually of cinnamon, fabric softener, and rich, dark roast coffee. Vincent Thorn, a man who possessed the net worth of a small European nation and a body count to match, was currently obsessed with mastering the perfect buttermilk pancake. "More syrup, Leo," Vincent rumbled in his impossibly deep baritone, wearing that ridiculous pink daisy apron over a tight white t-shirt. "Yes, please." Leo cheered from the kitchen table, kicking his little legs. Vincent poured the syrup with the kind of intense, calculating focus a sniper uses to gauge wind speed. His massive, scarred hands that had strangled cartel bosses were now delicately wiping a drop of maple syrup off a plastic dinosaur's snout. I leaned against the doorframe, sipping my coffee and watching this bizarre domestic tableau. My life had become a sitcom written by a psychopath. My burner phone buzzed in my pocket, shattering the illusion. I checked the screen. Silas Croft again. I sighed, walked into the cramped living room, and answered. "Rowan." "Status report," Silas demanded. The mechanical distortion on his voice couldn't hide his mounting impatience. "It has been 3 weeks. The reward on Thorn's ghost has doubled. Tell me you have something." "I have been shaking down every rat hole from Queens to Staten Island." I lied smoothly, dropping into my deadpan professional cadence. "I've checked the smuggling docks, the underground clinics, and the black market brokers. Thorn is a ghost. If he survived that acid bath, he vanished from New York completely." As I said this, a massive shadow fell over me. Vincent had walked into the living room. He didn't make a sound, a terrifying testament to his muscle memory, but his heavy, coffee-scented alpha pheromones rolled over me, warm and thick. He sat down on the sofa next to me. "Keep looking," Silas hissed through the speaker. "He is out there. I can feel it. When you find him, I want you to peel the skin from his bones before you put a bullet in his skull." "Understood," I said coldly. "I'll make it slow." I looked to my right. The phantom menace of New York, the man Silas wanted skinned alive, was holding a small plate. He had meticulously peeled a mandarin orange and carefully removed all the white stringy bits. With a completely blank, serious expression, Vincent picked up a perfectly clean orange wedge and held it up to my lips. I stared at him. He nudged my lip with the fruit, his amber eyes blinking expectantly. I opened my mouth, let him feed me the orange slice, and chewed. "I won't let you down, client," I mumbled around the citrus, my soul slowly leaving my body. "See that you don't." Silas snapped and hung up. I tossed the phone onto the coffee table and swallowed. "Vincent, why are you hand-feeding me fruit?" "You work hard," he replied, simply offering me another wedge. "You need vitamin C." I rubbed my face, questioning every life choice that had led me to this exact moment. But the illusion of the domesticated golden retriever couldn't last forever. I found that out 3 days later on a Tuesday afternoon. We were walking back from a grocery run. I was carrying 2 bags, Leo was holding Vincent's massive hand, and Vincent was carrying a 24-pack of bottled water on his shoulder like it weighed absolutely nothing. We took a shortcut through a narrow alley near my building, a mistake I usually avoided, but Leo was complaining about being tired. Halfway down the alley, 2 men stepped out from behind a dumpster. They were strung out, jittery, and holding cheap switchblades. "Empty your pockets," the taller one tweaked, pointing the blade at me. "Wallets, watches, now!" I sighed. I really didn't want to drop the eggs. I shifted my stance, preparing to kick the tall one's knee out when the air pressure in the alley suddenly dropped. A suffocating, localized wave of dominant alpha pheromones exploded from my right. It wasn't the needy, clingy scent Vincent usually directed at me. This was pure, unadulterated violence. It smelled like burning ash and blood. Before I could even blink, Vincent moved. He didn't drop Leo's hand. He didn't drop the pack of water. He simply stepped forward, moving with a fluid, terrifying speed that defied his massive size. He caught the mugger's wrist mid-thrust. A sickening crunch echoed off the brick walls as the man's arm snapped backward. The mugger screamed, dropping the knife. Vincent didn't even change his expression. He casually backhanded the second man with his free hand. The impact sounded like a heavy blow hitting a melon, sending the guy flying backward into the trash cans, out cold. It took exactly 3 seconds. Vincent looked at the groaning man with the broken arm, his amber eyes completely devoid of humanity. For a split second, the veil of amnesia lifted, and I saw the apex predator, the alpha who had conquered an empire with his bare hands. Then Leo tugged on his sleeve. "Can we go home now? I want mac and cheese." Vincent blinked. The terrifying aura vanished, instantly replaced by a mild, confused expression. "Yes, mac and cheese." He stepped over the moaning mugger and continued walking, holding Leo's hand. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs, realizing with ice-cold clarity that I wasn't harboring a stray dog. I was keeping a sleeping dragon in my living room. That night, after Leo went to bed, the gravity of the situation finally caught up with me. I was sitting on the edge of the bathtub, shirtless, cleaning a fresh scrape on my shoulder from a job that had gone sideways earlier that morning. I was tired, so incredibly tired. The bathroom door creaked open. Vincent stood in the frame, filling the entire space. His eyes immediately locked onto the scrape on my shoulder, and a low, distressed rumble vibrated in his chest. "I'm fine, you oversized brute," I muttered, reaching for a bandage. He stepped in, gently taking the bandage from my hand. I froze as his large, calloused fingers brushed against my skin. He carefully applied the adhesive, his touch unbelievably soft for a man who had snapped a bone like a dry twig hours ago. His fingertips lingered, tracing downward. They found an old, jagged bullet scar on my collarbone, a souvenir from my past life. "Who hurt you?" Vincent whispered, his voice dark and rough. His pheromones wrapped around me a heavy protective blanket that made my scarred omega scent glands hum in dangerous response. "A lot of people," I answered quietly, not looking up. "I will kill them," he stated, and there was no confusion in his voice, just absolute terrifying certainty. I finally looked up into his eyes. They were intense, focused entirely on me. A shiver ran down my spine, and it had nothing to do with fear. It was something worse. I was getting used to this. I was getting used to his warmth, his protection, his ridiculous apron. I was falling for a phantom. "Vincent," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the dripping faucet. "What happens when you remember who you are?" He tilted his head, his thumb gently stroking my collarbone. "I am the man who makes you pancakes. Why would I want to be anyone else?" I closed my eyes, terrified of the day the real Vincent Thorne would wake up and burn this little fantasy to the ground. The illusion of our bizarre domestic sitcom shattered on a rainy Thursday evening. Fittingly, Vincent was folding laundry. I was in the kitchen wiping down the counters, while Leo sat on the rug, attempting to teach Vincent the complex political hierarchy of his plastic dinosaur collection. The billionaire Mafia boss, wearing his trademark daisy apron, was solemnly paring my black tactical socks. "The T-Rex is the boss," Leo explained, waving a green piece of plastic. "But the Triceratops has horns, so he doesn't have to listen." "Understood," Vincent rumbled, nodding as if receiving a critical briefing on a rival syndicate. I smiled faintly, turning toward the sink. Then the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't a sound. It was an absence of sound. The distant perpetual hum of traffic outside our fourth-floor window had been eclipsed by the faint distinctive scuff of tactical boots on the fire escape. Multiple pairs. 15 years in the underworld had wired my brain for paranoia. Before my conscious mind could even process the threat, my body reacted. "Get down," I roared. The living room window exploded inward. A hail of suppressed submachine gun fire shredded the cheap drywall where my head had been a fraction of a second prior. Glass rained down like deadly confetti. I dove across the linoleum, hauling Leo under the heavy oak dining table. I looked up to see Vincent. He hadn't panicked. Driven by pure, unadulterated instinct, his massive body had instantly lunged to cover us, taking the brunt of the falling debris across his broad back. "Rowan!" Leo screamed, terrified. "I've got you, kid!" I hissed, my heart turning to ice. The cleaner persona died in that instant. The assassin woke up. I ripped the false bottom off the kitchen cabinet, pulling out my heavily modified Sig Sauer P226 and 2 spare magazines. I racked the slide. "Vincent, stay on top of him. Do not move," I ordered. The heavy front door splintered as a breaching charge blew the deadbolt out of the frame. 3 men in dark tactical gear poured into the narrow hallway. Silas Croft's mercenaries. They had found the ghost. I didn't hesitate. I stepped out from the kitchen threshold and double-tapped the first man in the chest, tracking up to put a 3rd round through his visor. He dropped instantly. The other 2 returned fire, shredding my cheap sofa. I ducked back, the ozone smell of discharged cordite mixing violently with the sudden sharp spike of my own distressed omega pheromones. "Target acquired," one of the mercenaries shouted into a comms unit. "We have the ghost. He's with a rogue cleaner, and wait." The mercenary paused. In the chaos of the scramble, Leo's oversized sweater had snagged on a chair leg. A heavy silver necklace, one he always wore, hidden beneath his clothes, a trinket left by his biological mother, had slipped free, catching the dim hallway light. It was a complex crest, 2 wolves flanking a shattered crown. The mercenary's eyes widened behind his tactical goggles. "Command confirm visual on a secondary target. The kid. He's wearing the silver crest. It's the lost Thorn bastard." My blood ran cold. The lost Thorn bastard. My mind raced, connecting dots I had been too blind to see. Leo wasn't just some random orphan. He was Thorn blood, the last surviving heir of a branch family that Silas had supposedly wiped out years ago. Silas wasn't just hunting Vincent, he was hunting the true bloodline. And I had practically gift-wrapped them both. "Kill the kid." The comms crackled loudly. "Take Thorn alive if you can, but kill the kid." The mercenary raised his weapon, aiming straight for the space under the table. "No," I screamed, lunging out of cover, my gun raising too slowly. But I didn't need to be fast. The air pressure in the room vanished, sucked into a vacuum of terrifying, suffocating alpha dominance. Vincent moved. He didn't just move, he erupted. He launched himself over the dining table, placing his massive frame directly between the muzzle of the gun and Leo. A deafening gunshot cracked through the air. Vincent let out a low, guttural grunt. His head snapped to the side as a spray of crimson painted the peeling wallpaper. He crashed onto the floor, clutching his temple blood pouring through his fingers. "Vincent!" I yelled, my voice cracking. Something inside me snapped. The psychological walls I had built around my scarred omega scent glands shattered. The smell of his blood, the blood of an alpha protecting my pup, triggered a violent primal reaction in my biology. My pheromones exploded outward, flooding the room, not with fear, but with absolute protective omega rage. It smelled like burning ash and poisoned honey. I stepped forward, firing 3 rapid shots. The second mercenary's knee shattered, and before he could scream, my next bullet pierced his throat. I spun to the third man, the one who had shot Vincent, but my gun clicked empty. The mercenary grinned, aiming his rifle at my chest. Tough luck, Omega, he sneered. Suddenly, a massive blood-soaked hand reached up from the floor and wrapped around the barrel of the mercenary's rifle. The mercenary froze. We both looked down. Vincent was kneeling. The bullet had only grazed his skull, leaving a nasty gash, but the physical trauma combined with the explosive trigger of my distressed omega pheromones had acted as a chemical catalyst. The mental dam had burst. Vincent slowly looked up. The mild, confused golden retriever was gone. The man who wore the pink daisy apron was dead. Staring back at the mercenary were the eyes of the apex predator, cold amber and devoid of any human mercy. He didn't say a word. Vincent simply ripped the assault rifle from the man's grip like he was taking a toy from a toddler. With his other hand, he grabbed the mercenary by the tactical vest, stood up to his full terrifying height, and slammed him against the wall so hard the plaster cracked. "You shot me," Vincent whispered. His voice was no longer a gentle rumble. It was the razor-sharp hiss of a guillotine blade. With a sickening crunch, Vincent twisted his wrist. The mercenary's neck snapped instantly. Vincent let the lifeless body drop to the floor. He stood amidst the smoke, the blood, and the corpses of Silas's men. His chest heaved, his overwhelming alpha pheromones filling the room suffocating and dominant, reclaiming his stolen territory. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The blood from his temple dripped down his jaw, staining the collar of his shirt. His amber eyes locked onto mine, stripping away every lie, every disguise, every secret I had ever kept. "Rowan," Vincent said. Not cleaner, not a confused question. He said my name with the absolute authority of a king reclaiming his throne. The amnesia was gone. The tyrant of New York had returned, and he was standing in my living room. We abandoned the Brooklyn apartment in under 3 minutes. It was a burned asset anyway. By 3 in the morning, the three of us were holed up in one of my ghost properties, a decommissioned, heavily fortified bank vault hidden beneath a failing laundromat in Queens. Leo, exhausted by the gunfire and the adrenaline crash, was dead to the world, asleep on a tactical cot in the inner safe room, with noise-canceling headphones strapped over his tiny ears. That left me alone in the main room with the apex predator. Vincent was sitting on a metal crate, bare-chested, while I meticulously stitched the bullet graze on his temple. The bleeding had stopped, but the tension in the room was so thick you could choke on it. When he had snapped that mercenary's neck, I had seen the tyrant. I had heard him say my name with the cold, absolute clarity of a man who owned the city. But now, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, Vincent looked up at me with wide, confused amber eyes. "Rowan," he murmured, his voice softening into that familiar, gravelly rumble. "My head hurts. Who were those bad men?" I paused, the suturing needle hovering a millimeter from his skin. Oh, this absolute bastard. He was lying. A normal person might have been fooled by the puppy dog eyes, but 15 years as an assassin had made me an expert in micro-expressions and, more importantly, biology. Before the attack, Vincent's pheromones had been a messy, clingy haze of dark roast coffee and confusion. Now the scent was distinctly different. It was deeper, sharper. It smelled like espresso roasted over an open flame, calculated, lethal, and dripping with an overwhelming territorial possessiveness. It was the scent of an alpha who knew exactly who he was, what he owned, and what he wanted. He remembered everything. Silas, the betrayal, the acid bath, me. But the terrifying overlord of the New York underworld was currently pretending to be a brain-damaged golden retriever because of what he liked my cooking. He liked wearing the daisy apron. A slow, wicked idea bloomed in my mind. If the tyrant wanted to play house, I was going to make him work for it. They were just some thugs, big guy, I said, smoothly tying off the stitch and snipping the thread. I patted his massive scarred cheek a little too hard. "Good thing you're so tough. But since you're feeling well enough to ask questions, you can make yourself useful." I walked over to the supply closet, grabbed a bucket, a stiff bristled brush, and a bottle of industrial bleach. I dropped them at his feet. "The safe house is dusty," I ordered, crossing my arms. "Scrub the floors and don't miss the corners." For a fraction of a second, the puppy dog illusion cracked. Vincent stared at the scrub brush. A muscle in his jaw feathered and his alpha pheromones spiked with a flash of aristocratic indignation. The billionaire CEO, a man who likely hadn't touched a cleaning product in 3 decades, looked like he wanted to snap the mop in half. I tilted my head, raising an eyebrow. "Is there a problem, Vincent?" He blinked instantly, forcing his eyes to widen into a mild, obedient stare. "No, Rowan, I will scrub." For the next 2 hours, I sat on a stool cleaning my weapons, while the deadliest man on the East Coast painstakingly scrubbed the concrete floor on his hands and knees. Every time he missed a spot I'd pointed out, he would grind his teeth so hard I could hear it from across the room, but he would obediently go back and scrub it again. It was the most entertaining petty revenge I had ever experienced, but the game couldn't last. Biology has a cruel way of ruining a good time. It started around 5 in the morning. The air pressure in the underground vault began to change. The temperature spiked. I was wiping gun oil off my slide when my breath suddenly hitched. The air had grown heavy, suffocatingly dense, with a suffocating wave of pure, unfiltered alpha dominance. I looked up. Vincent had stopped scrubbing. He was still on his knees, his broad back facing me, but his massive shoulders were heaving. The scrub brush snapped in half under his grip. The rut, the physical trauma of the gunshot combined with the explosive trigger of my distressed omega pheromones earlier had finally shattered the last of his biological restraints. His delayed alpha rut wasn't just arriving, it was crashing down like a tidal wave. He slowly stood up, dropping the broken pieces of plastic. When he turned to face me, the good boy facade was completely, utterly gone. His amber eyes were dilated, practically glowing in the dim light, fixated on me with a hunger that made every instinct in my body scream to run, but I couldn't move. His pheromones physically pinned me to the chair, commanding submission. "Vincent!" I warned, my hand instinctively dropping to the combat knife strapped to my thigh. "Drop it," he commanded. It wasn't a request. The sheer weight of his alpha voice slammed into my chest, making my scarred scent glands ache. He crossed the room in 2 terrifyingly fast strides. Before I could even draw the blade, his hand shot out, wrapping around my wrist. He pinned my arms above my head against the cold concrete wall, his massive body pressing flush against mine. The heat radiating off him was unbelievable. "You knew," he breathed, his voice a dark, lethal rasp right against my ear. "I knew," I gasped, fighting the intoxicating fog of his scent. "You're a terrible actor, Thorne." "And you," he growled, burying his face into the crook of my neck, inhaling my burning ash and honey scent, like he was starving, "are a cruel little monster, making me scrub floors. You earned it." He chuckled, a dark, vibrating sound that sent a shiver straight down my spine. But then his grip on my wrists shifted. It didn't tighten, it loosened. His large, calloused hand slid down my arms, interlacing his fingers with mine. He pressed his forehead against my shoulder, his breathing ragged and desperate. The terrifying tyrant was shaking. "Rowan," he whispered, and the absolute authority in his voice broke, replaced by a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "I remember the acid. I remember the Empire. I remember all the blood." He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes. The apex predator looked completely at my mercy. "If I told you I remembered," Vincent confessed, his voice thick with the desperation of his root, "I thought you would look at me the way everyone else does. Like a monster, like a target. I thought you would throw me out." My breath caught in my throat. This man who could buy countries and order assassinations with a flick of his wrist was terrified of losing a cramped, peeling apartment and a pink daisy apron. "You are a monster, Vincent," I said softly, my heart pounding against my ribs. He flinched, his eyes dropping. "But," I continued, freeing my hands from his loose grip to cup his rugged, blood-stained face, "you're my monster now." His amber eyes snapped back to mine, blazing with a sudden, overwhelming fire. The air in the vault ignited. I didn't wait for him to ask again. I tilted my head to the side, deliberately exposing the sensitive, scarred flesh of my omega scent gland. It was the ultimate surrender, an invitation I hadn't offered to anyone in 15 years. "Mark me," I whispered. Vincent let out a guttural, possessive groan. He wrapped his arms around my waist, lifting me off the ground effortlessly, and buried his teeth into my neck. The pain was sharp, followed instantly by a rushing, euphoric wave of binding heat. Blood, gunpowder, and coffee tangled permanently with ash and honey. In the shadows of the safe house, the king reclaimed his throne, and the assassin finally found his home. We left Leo sleeping soundly in the secure subterranean bunker in Queens, guarded by a retired Mossad tracker who owed me 3 favors. I knew my son was safe. That meant Rowan the cleaner could finally go to work. Thorn Tower rose 60 stories above the Manhattan skyline, a monument of polished steel and black glass that practically screamed untouchable. But tonight the king had returned to claim his stolen crown, and he had brought his personal executioner with him. Vincent was back in his element. He had discarded my borrowed flannel for a bespoke charcoal three-piece suit that fit his massive frame like armor. The bloody bandage on his temple was gone, replaced by a clean, flesh-colored suture. He looked every bit the terrifying, cold-blooded alpha who ruled the city's concrete canyons. I, on the other hand, was dressed in my favorite color, tactical black. The executive elevator requires biometric verification. I murmured, adjusting the earpiece of our secure comms as we slipped through the underground service entrance. Silas has locked down the entire penthouse floor. He's got at least 20 heavily armed mercenaries on standby. Then we don't use the elevator. Vincent's deep voice rumbled in my ear. His tone vibrated with a dangerous, lethal calm. Rowan, do you remember the structural blueprints I had you study in the truck? I memorized maps for Breakfast Thorn. I'm already in the ventilation shafts. Good. When I cut the secondary power grid, the emergency fire shutters will drop. You'll have exactly 40 seconds to clear the server room before the security team realizes it's a manual override. 40 seconds. I let out a soft, dry chuckle as I crawled through the dusty metal duct. You're getting demanding, boss. I liked you better when you were burning my eggs. If we survive tonight, I will let you burn the entire kitchen down, he replied. His alpha pheromones leaked through the earpiece, no longer the chaotic, needy haze of his amnesia, but a focused, razor-sharp edge of absolute possession. He had marked me, and my biology hummed in perfect lethal synchronization with his. I reached the vent grate overlooking the server room. Beneath me, 3 of Silas's elite guards stood with rifles raised, nervously scanning the doors. Going dark, I whispered. The lights in Thorn Tower died. In the sudden absolute blackness, the emergency red strobes began to spin. I kicked the grate open, dropping silently from the ceiling. My combat knife found the first guard's neck before he could even register the sound of my landing. The second man spun, but I double-tapped him in the chest with my suppressed Sig Sauer. The third lunged, but my hand-to-hand training took over. I caught his wrist, twisted, and drove his own rifle butt into his jaw, sending him crashing into the server racks. 31 seconds had passed. I slammed a bypass drive into the main security console, uploading the decryption key Vincent had written for me. Console breached. Shutters are locking down. Vincent, you're clear. Entering, he rumbled. While I controlled the cameras and security routes from the server room, Vincent walked through the front doors of his own empire like a phantom. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He walked down the grand marble corridors of the executive suites with a slow, deliberate stride. Through the security monitors, I watched in awe as 3 mercenaries turned a corner and spotted him. They raised their weapons, but Vincent didn't even draw a gun. He simply released a suffocating wave of pure, unfiltered alpha dominance. The sheer biological weight of his presence made the mercenaries hesitate for a fraction of a second, their instincts screaming at them that they were facing an apex predator. That fraction of a second was all Vincent needed. He closed the distance in a blur, disarming the lead shooter, using him as a human shield against the others, and clearing the hallway with brutal, terrifying efficiency. He moved like a hurricane in a tailored suit. 10 minutes later, we met at the double doors of the penthouse office. I stepped out from the shadows, reloading my magazine. Vincent looked down at me, his eyes glowing amber in the dim emergency lights. He reached out his large hand, gently cupping the back of my neck, his thumb tracing the freshly healed mark on my scent gland. The possessive warmth of his touch washed over me, steadying my racing pulse. "Are you ready?" he asked. "I'm the one who drops the trash, Vincent," I said, a slow, wicked grin spreading across my face. "Let's clean this office." Vincent kicked the heavy mahogany doors off their hinges. Silas Croft was standing by the panoramic window, a heavy silver revolver in his hand, looking like a rat trapped in a gold-plated cage. He was pale, his eyes darting frantically between us. He had 5 mercenaries left, all of them trembling. "Vincent," Silas gasped, trying to maintain his arrogant posture. "You're a ghost. You should be a pile of sludge in a Brooklyn shipyard. Your cleaner was incompetent," Vincent said smoothly, stepping into the room. He didn't look at the guns pointed at him. He looked at Silas like he was a minor accounting error. He decided to keep me instead. Silas sneered, his gaze shifting to me. "Rowan, the legendary ghost of the underground. You sold out a $1 million contract for what? to be this monster's dog. Look at him, Rowan. He's a tyrant. He will use you and discard you the moment he doesn't need you. I leaned casually against the door frame, twirling my pistol on my finger. Actually, Silas, he's a pretty decent cook, and he folds my socks. You really can't find that kind of domestic help these days. You fools! Silas shrieked, his composure completely shattering. Shoot them! Kill them both! The room erupted into gunfire. I dove behind a leather sofa, returning fire with lethal precision. Vincent moved like a shadow, his sheer size and speed overwhelming the remaining mercenaries before they could even align their sights. It was a symphony of violence, suppressed gunshots, shattered glass, and the heavy metallic tang of blood filling the air. Within 2 minutes, the mercenaries were all on the floor, disarmed and groaning. Silas was backed against the shattered glass window, the cold New York wind howling through the penthouse. Vincent stepped forward, his boots crunching on the glass. He grabbed Silas by the collar of his expensive coat, lifting him effortlessly off the ground, dangling him over the 60-story drop. Wait, Vincent, please. Silas whimpered, his hands clawing uselessly at Vincent's iron grip. We were partners. I did it for the corporation. Vincent stared at him, his face carved from stone. You tampered with my mother's brakes. You poisoned my father. You tried to murder my son. There is no corporation left for you, Silas. You're weak, Vincent. Silas spat, his voice cracking with terror. You let an Omega put a leash on you. Vincent tilted his head, a dark, chilling smile touching his lips. He's not pulling my strings, Silas. He's holding the leash. Vincent whispered, his voice a razor-sharp guillotine. And you should thank him, because if he lets go, there won't be enough of you left to bury. With a brutal shove, Vincent threw Silas back onto the concrete floor of the penthouse, just as the office doors burst open again. Federal agents, led by a stern-faced officer, flooded the room with weapons raised. Vincent didn't look surprised. He had leaked the decryption files to the federal servers the moment we breached the building. The entire Thorn Corporation's illegal history was already broadcasting live on every major news outlet in America. As the agents dragged a screaming Silas away in handcuffs, the penthouse quieted down. Vincent turned to me. The tyrant of Manhattan looked exhausted, his broad shoulders slightly slumped, but as his amber eyes locked onto mine, the coldness vanished. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. What's that? I asked, frowning. More evidence. He pulled out a crumpled, blood-stained piece of pink fabric. It was the Brooklyn Rules-made contract we had signed in my cramped kitchen, complete with Leo's messy crayon signatures. Vincent smoothed out the paper on an intact glass table, bit his thumb to draw a drop of blood, and pressed his bloody thumbprint onto the signature line. I believe my cleaning bill is overdue, Vincent said, his voice dropping into that gravelly, affectionate rumble. He slid the paper toward me. Along with his thumbprint, he had written a legally binding transfer of all his personal assets, billions of dollars real estate, and trust funds to Rowan and Leo. I stared at the paper, then up at the deadliest alpha in New York, who was currently looking at me like he was waiting for a gold star. You're insane, Thorn, I muttered, my heart doing a strange fluttering flip. I am a man who pays his debts, Vincent replied, stepping closer, his arms wrapping around my waist, pulling me into his chest. And I still owe you for those burnt pancakes. Exactly 1 year and 2 months after I decided not to melt the apex predator of Manhattan into a toxic puddle, I found myself standing in the kitchen of a 60-story penthouse, watching him argue with a 6-year-old about the structural integrity of a pancake. The T-Rex needs a longer tail, Leo insisted, standing on a custom velvet stool, pointing a syrup-sticky finger at the frying pan. Otherwise, he's going to fall over when he runs. A Tyrannosaurus Rex relies on its heavy skull and jaw for balance. Leo, the terrifying tyrant of the New York underworld, replied in his deep, deadpan baritone. The tail is merely a counterweight. Furthermore, pancake batter does not adhere strictly to the laws of paleontology. Just give him a longer tail, Vincent, I called out from the doorway, leaning against the doorframe with my arms crossed. Vincent Thorn, multi-billionaire CEO and the undisputed alpha king of the city, paused. He looked down at the frying pan, then at Leo, and finally over his shoulder at me. He was wearing a bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than my old Brooklyn apartment. His hair was perfectly styled, his amber eyes sharp and clear, ready for the board meeting he had in exactly 45 minutes. And over that immaculate, terrifyingly powerful exterior, he was wearing a faded, violently pink apron covered in yellow daisies. He hadn't let me throw it away. In fact, I was pretty sure he had his tailor reinforce the stitching. As you wish. Vincent rumbled obediently, tipping the bowl to add a slightly deformed blob of batter to the dinosaur's rear end. I let out a soft, amused exhale and walked into the kitchen. The penthouse was a fortress equipped with bulletproof glass, a private elevator with biometric locks, and a security team of ex-special forces stationed on the floor below. It was the impenetrable castle Silas had always wanted. But Silas was currently rotting in a federal supermax prison, and this castle didn't smell like cold steel and paranoia. It smelled like cinnamon dark roast coffee and the warm, suffocatingly safe scent of a protective alpha. The television in the adjacent living room was quietly murmuring the morning financial news. The anchor was practically tripping over her words as she praised the Thorn Corporation's latest philanthropic initiative, a massive citywide fund dedicated to protecting vulnerable omegas and displaced children. The underworld empire hadn't vanished. Vincent had simply dragged it into the light, restructuring his massive wealth to build rather than destroy. The media called him a visionary, a reformed, ruthless titan. I just called him the idiot who still occasionally burned the toast. As I reached the marble island, Vincent plated the slightly disfigured T-Rex pancake and set it in front of a beaming Leo. Then he turned to me. The mild domestic facade didn't drop, but the air between us shifted. His alpha pheromones, which used to be a chaotic defensive wall, now wrapped around me like a tailored second skin. He stepped into my space, moving with that fluid, predatory grace, and handed me a mug of black coffee. As I took it, he leaned down. His large hand cupped the back of my neck, his thumb instinctively finding the raised permanent bite mark resting over my scent gland. A jolt of warmth shot down my spine. Even after a year, the bond still hummed with electric intensity. He pressed his lips to the corner of my mouth, tasting like espresso and possessive heat. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt all the way to my toes. "You're going to be late for your hostile takeover, Thorn," I muttered, taking a sip of the coffee to hide the stupid smile threatening to break across my face. "The board can wait," Vincent replied, completely unbothered. He reached out, gently wiping a smudge of flour off my cheek. "I still need to pack Leo's lunch. And you have a meeting with your real estate broker today, don't you?" "Yeah, the new youth shelter in Queens needs a structural inspection before we sign the lease," I said, leaning into his touch just a fraction. I was officially retired from the cleaning business. The combat knives and suppressed pistols were locked in a biometric safe hidden behind a bookshelf, replaced by blueprints and charity foundation paperwork. I didn't smell like bleach and gunpowder anymore. My ash and honey scent had finally settled, permanently tangled with the rich, grounded aroma of my alpha. I looked at him, at the scars on his knuckles, the sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw, and the ridiculous pink ruffles of the apron contrasting with his deadly aura. I used to hide in the shadows, convinced that survival meant staying invisible, staying cold, and trusting absolutely no one. I was an assassin who had accepted that he would die alone in the dark. Then I met a corpse in a rainy Brooklyn shipyard. The world out there, the executives and the rival syndicates, they whispered about us. They said that Vincent Thorn was weak because he let an Omega hold his leash. They thought love was a vulnerability, a fatal flaw in the armor of a king. They were wrong. They didn't understand that a wild beast is dangerous when it's hungry, but it becomes truly terrifyingly invincible when it has something to protect. "Vincent," I said softly as he turned back to the stove to start cleaning the pans. "Yes, Rowan," he answered, looking over his broad shoulder, those golden eyes locking onto mine with absolute unwavering devotion. "The coffee is perfect," I smiled. "But if you wear that apron to the boardroom, I am filing for divorce." Vincent tilted his head, a slow, wicked grin spreading across face, making him look every bit the devil that ruled New York. "You wouldn't dare, Rowan," he purred, his voice dropping into that dark velvet register. "Who would make your pancakes?" I chuckled, pulling my mug close to my chest, listening to Leo happily narrating a battle between his syrup-drenched dinosaur and a piece of bacon. I looked at my son. I looked at my monster. I was exactly where I belonged.